I'm going to talk to you a bit about the book and a bit about one particular aspect of the book which I thought might appeal to you, which is some of the interpreters on the South China coast and what that tells. So to take that angle on the book. So the book is, just to give you a very brief introduction for those of you who haven't already seen, the book is about the interpreters for the first British embassy to China, led by Lord Macartney. That is Li Zibiao and George Thomas Staunton. And I began writing this book when I found Li Zibiao's letters about describing how he had acted as interpreter for the embassy when I was in the archives of the Vatican in Rome. And I thought that it would be interesting to write about the story of a Chinese man who spent 20 years in Europe and who also wrote about his experiences in Europe. So in addition to the Macartney side of it being very interesting, new take on the Macartney embassy. So Li Zibiao is a fascinating character. He came from Wuwei, what's now Wuwei, and was in Liangzhou on the Silk Road in Gansu. His brother was a mid-ranking officer in the Qing army, and his family was Catholic. And he'd been sent to study in Naples to be a Catholic priest at the age of 12. And so if you go over to slide 2, so if we start the slides.
I will start the slide.
Yes, because we have a slide. Yeah.
Can everybody see the slides?
Yes, well, I can.
Great.
Here we see Li Zibiao, a story about his brother's son in a local history text from Wuwei, and also a painting of the school in Naples where he studied to be a priest. The painting's about 10 years after he left, but presumably looked about the same. And so when he was taking part in the Macartney embassy, he was interpreting into Latin, which all properly educated Europeans in the 18th century could in fact speak Latin. I think we often forget this, or into Italian. And Lord Macartney, the British ambassador, spoke Italian. Like many men of the 18th century elite British men, he'd done a grand tour where you learned languages in an informal spoken environment. And then, so initially I thought it would be really interesting to write a bit about Li Zibiao. But if we then go on to the next slide, I kept being asked about George Thomas Staunton, who was famous for going on this embassy as a child and interpreting for it. And that's the reason he's famous for that, is because his father wrote the book about the embassy in an attempt to get him a job as in the East India Company. And so he put him right in the middle of the story of the embassy, even though he was only 12. But actually, he is genuinely a very interesting character, and I became more and more fascinated by George Staunton. He went on to work for the East India Company in Guangzhou. He made a lot of money because he was a very enthusiastic mathematician. In fact, if you look carefully at that picture of him as a child, you'll see that he has a copy of Euclid, and this enabled him to do a lot of calculations very quickly. He made money from exploiting differentials in interest rates. And of course, he's most famous, especially to a translation studies audience, as the translator of the Qing legal code, the first book to be translated directly from Chinese into English. And he went on to become a member of parliament at the time of the Opium Wars, and in fact spoke in favor of the Opium Wars, which was very different from the stand he'd taken for the rest of his life. So looking at these people, one of the discoveries of the book was about the number of people who had the linguistic and cultural skills to interpret between China and Europe, especially on South China's maritime frontier. So I think that I had initially imagined, well, in fact, when George Leonard Staunton, the father of George Thomas, wrote the book about the embassy, he suggested that it was incredibly difficult to find an interpreter. But actually, that is not really, I mean, that was partly about playing up his son so his son would get this job. That wasn't really the case. So today I'm going to focus on that aspect of the book and then explain a little of the overall argument. And finally tell you a little more about some of my ongoing research after the book about these characters. So if we now go on to the next slide. So George Leonard Staunton has this account that it was almost impossible to find interpreters for Chinese. What he says is the British in Canton didn't know Chinese. The only one who did know some Chinese had recently died, and no one in London could speak or read the language. So he made this very difficult journey across France, where a French missionary who'd been in China refused to go back to China, then over the mountains in winter over the Alps, into Italy, where he found 2 Chinese able to interpret in the college in Naples. One of those Chinese is Li Zibiao, and the other of them is Ke Zongxiao, Paulo Ke. That's how they spelt it. Often in a lot of books in English, write his name as if it was Zhou or Chou. But he's actually, his surname was Ke. They were a big Chinese Christian family, elite Chinese Christian family in Beijing. And it turned out that Ke Zongxiao actually did not have a suitable character to be an interpreter for the English. He thought they were Protestants and that he really disapproved strongly of Protestants. He was a Catholic, and he had a kind of irascible temper. But there were, in fact, other people around who could have interpreted. One of the people I found out about when I was doing this story is someone called John Anthony, who was a sailor. So there'd been Chinese sailors, and John Anthony, despite his name, is a Chinese person. There'd been Chinese sailors in London from at least 1780. These are not men of the social class that someone like Macartney would respect. And I think one of the things that came out of this project and has been really interested is the difficulties of valuing people's implicit, their tacit knowledge of languages, things that are not coming out of books, but just something that you learn. We know about John Anthony because he actually became involved in various legal cases in London where he acted as the interpreter. He'd left China at the age of 11. He was shipping in and out between England, America, and China from the 1780s. We know he owned a pocketbook, so we know he was literate. He married an English woman, and he later ran a lodging house for Chinese sailors for the East India Company, and about which there was a government inquiry later because it was very kind to the Chinese sailors and not so good to the Indian sailors. And when the Chinese sailors got into difficulties, when they were robbed or had other legal matters, John Anthony came forward as an interpreter. There's also William Macau, who obviously took the surname Macau. He's another Chinese person about there's been a wonderful recent study. And he, by a British local historian, he came from China as a servant, but then he got going in Scotland and he became a senior officer in the customs, the Scottish government customs offices in the 1850s and 60s. And this kind of, the Macartney Embassy didn't know about these people, but they could have known about these people. It's about the way they think they're looking for an interpreter and what they're looking for. And these issues become even more obvious when the embassy, the Lord Macartney's embassy, reaches Asia. So in fact, Lord Macartney didn't just bring 2 priests back, Chinese priests back from Naples to China to interpret. There were also 2 others who traveled with the embassy as passengers because their classmates, Li Zibiao and Ke Zongxiao, had asked that as a favor. And one of these is someone called Yan Quanren. Li and Ke had been selected because they spoke North China dialect, and the embassy was aware that that was something important. And Yan Quanren came from Fujian. But he might in many ways have been more suitable because Li Zibiao had traveled to Europe at the age of 12, and his Chinese education, they had continued to study Chinese in Naples, but his Chinese education was sketchy. Whereas Yang Quanren's Chinese education had a full Chinese education to age 18 in an elite family in Zhangzhou before he came to Naples to study. And he then turned out to be an excellent linguist who quickly learned a very high level of Latin and Italian. He came from a Zhangzhou merchant family with a long history of foreign contacts and emigration. His ancestor was a notable early convert to Christianity. He was in fact the second generation of his own family to study in Naples. And he had a relative who was a priest in Thailand and another one who was considering studying for the Catholic priesthood in India. And it was probably he who produced a draft translation of Macartney's letter from the British King, which is now in the British Government Foreign Office archives. And he interpreted for the embassy in Vietnam, because at that point, Li Zibiao was ill with scurvy because of the poor diet on the voyage. And when he was there in Vietnam, he used pen conversations, as you can imagine, in Asia, but he also tried various Chinese dialects. At times they had to speak to uneducated people, and he spoke various South China dialects and was able to find, in fact, in one case when they arrived on an island, a woman who could speak Chinese and was able to fetch someone suitable. But he was traveling with the embassy as a passenger, and he hadn't agreed to do this. And he insisted on continuing on to his activities as a missionary, and the embassy had agreed to set him on shore in Macau. Then there, of course, are the Hong merchants. So there's often been the idea that the Hong merchants only spoke a very limited amount of Chinese, and certainly they spoke Chinese in this, that the style of speech was this pidgin of the frontier. And they'd been called on to cooperate with senior British merchants to produce a written translation of a letter from the head of the East India Company announcing the embassy. And their translation is basically dreadful. It's very short and very unclear. But that is almost certainly due to intentional concealment by the English of the aims of the embassy. The aims of this embassy were for an island off the coast of China, a British resident at the Chinese court who could try and influence the emperor, and lower taxes. And the British obviously didn't want to say these things. So they produced, they bogged down with spending a lot of time trying to translate the titles of the English king, which was difficult to do. But when there were serious negotiations going on in Guangzhou, it's Pan Youdu himself, not the Tongshi, who does those negotiations. His father had lived in the Philippines, had been a very fluent Spanish speaker, who was then an early learner of English. And he clearly has a capacity to interpret. He interprets in a particular style that will achieve his own aims, because he's a big businessman seriously involved in the trade. There's also the Macau Translation Office, which I think has been wildly understudied. So this is a regular office run by the Portuguese, but which deals with the Portuguese official translation with the Qing. And actually, I've got a student, Jacob Fordham, who's working, who has good Portuguese, who's working on this at the moment, this early period. And there's massive amounts of material, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this. And anyone who's seen the most of the translations of the Macau Translation Office will know that they're very precise and accurate translations between Portuguese and Chinese of Qing official correspondence. On this particular occasion, they produced a very short and inadequate letter, but that's clearly because they have a particular goal, which is a Portuguese goal. So one of the British goals is to either take over Macau from the Portuguese, or to have an island that will supplant Macau. So obviously the Portuguese are going to oppose this embassy, and they have their own line. So their translation is going to try to not to lead to British success, let's put it that way. So again, these are political choices in interpreting. There are then a couple of people who actually do interpret for the embassy for a while. Pan Youdu is asked to interpret, but gets out of it. Okay, he and Cai Shiwen, who were one of the Ahong merchants, are told that they should go and interpret for the embassy, and they say it would be very inconvenient for them to do so, and they don't want to. However, the British merchants in Guangzhou do manage to find the son of one of their Tongshu, who we only know, and I've only been able to find this Spanish name for him, Antonio. He had lived in Manila in the Philippines, and he could speak both Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. And the East India Company sent him off to look for the embassy. The embassy was very late arriving because of it had got very poor wind when it was sailing up through Southeast Asia. And so the East India Company in Guangzhou was very concerned, and they sent a boat to look for the embassy, and they sent Antonio on that boat with the idea that he would act as an interpreter, and the British treated him as a gentleman. So he dined at the the captain's table, which is a sign of his status. And then there is someone called Lorenzo da Silva. So this is someone from the mixed frontier culture of Macau. He was a servant, so an employee living in the household of Claude Letondal, who was the procurator of the French mission, and Letondal offered him to Macartney, and he could speak Chinese, Latin, Portuguese, and French. So he was extremely multilingual, and he turned out to be extremely complicated. So what's interesting about these people, particularly about Antonio and Lorenzo da Silva, is why they weren't used. They were both actually very effective translators, because we have reports from Qing officials who dealt with them as the embassy journeyed up the Chinese coast. If you match together exactly what the English are saying on what dates and who was on what ship and where, you can work out which interpreter the Chinese officials are talking about. Antonio dealt with Ma Yu, the Zhoushan naval commander. He told him he came from the Philippines. Ma told Antonio that the British mustn't sail further north. The British paid no attention to this. And at the next port Antonio came to, the Qing officials held him responsible for the fact that the British had continued to sail north and threatened to punish him. And Antonio really lost his nerve at this point. He'd been very excited, apparently, to go and see the emperor. He realized at this point that this was not actually such a safe or good idea. And he really withdrew when uniforms were being made for the interpreters. He absolutely refused to have a uniform made for him. Lorenzo da Silva was a much cooler character, and he handled the interpretation with Liang Kentang, who was the Zhili Zongdu, the Governor General of Zhili. And he handled that in collaboration with Johannes Huttner, who was a very fluent Latin speaker on the embassy, who was German. They provided extremely detailed and effective account of their discussions and negotiations about how the embassy should travel to Beijing. In the end, Macartney decided not to take Lorenzo da Silva because he thought he would spy for the Portuguese. Even though he'd been provided by the French, the British think that the French Catholics will back them because the French Revolution has just taken place, and the revolution is very anti-Catholic. Anti-Christian, as you will probably know. So that's why they decide to use Li Zibiao, whose connections are not with the trade, but simply with the Vatican, which is something which, interestingly, the Protestant British state thinks is less of a problem than the specific interests all these other people have with the trade, which they really don't want intervention from. So they didn't necessarily, Li Zibiao was, and Yan Quanren would have been far the most linguistically competent interpreters. Li Zibiao had limited Chinese language education. And of course, George Thomas Staunton, who they also continued to help to use, had simply been learning Chinese on the boat from Kezhongxiao since, I mean, it's a year voyage, and he was a very good learner, but he was only 12. So I think what we have to understand here is they want, above all, an interpreter who doesn't have an opposing political or financial agenda. So let's go on now to the next slide. So those are the interpreters. That's just a very small part of the book that just tells you about the particular availability of interpreters, trying to make us think a bit about interpreting as something for which many people could have done. There were many people with these skills, but there were reasons why people get chosen and why people do it, which are not just about linguistic ability. So what I want to do now is to explain a bit about the importance of the role of interpreters more generally. So this is the big argument of the book. The first point that I want to make is that interpreters in this period particularly, but also now, have a lot of power because they're actually involved in the negotiations. And obviously in the actual interpretation meetings that count for the Macartney embassy, Li Zibiao is the only person present. So there are, of course, Jesuits in Beijing. The Qianlong Emperor has appointed Bernardo Almeida as interpreter for the embassy, but the British insist on using Li Zibiao, and interestingly, He Shen approves that. So the actual moments which really matter, which are the meeting with Qianlong at court, which is in Chengde, and the discussions afterwards in the gardens of Chengde with Songyun, which go on, and He Shen and Fu Chang'an, which go on over several days, those just involve Li Zibiao. And he's the only person there who knows what the two sides are saying, and he introduces his own item into the negotiations. Which is a request for the toleration of Christianity, which the British did not intend to put forward, and which we know was in the negotiations because the Qianlong Emperor turns it down in his list of the points that he's refusing, and Li Zibiao explained to Italy, back when he wrote back to Rome, he explained that he had done this. So that's one aspect of the power of the role. And then another aspect, which I'm sure that will be more obvious to all of you who do, or very obvious to all of you who do modern or more modern kinds of translation studies, is that information is always shaped as it's transmitted. This is a point that needs to be made more importantly to some historians. And that the spoken interpreter has to make those decisions about shaping the information at great speed, so that acting as interpreter is not just a matter of how good you are at languages, the two languages concerned. It's also about how successful you can be as a negotiator, how well you negotiate, and anyone in that negotiating role will have their own agenda in the negotiations, almost certainly. And this produces, I argue, significant dangers for the interpreter. So Li Zibiao wrote afterwards that interpreting for the embassy was something that not even the most stupid person would have done if they understood the danger. And I think one of the particular reasons for that danger is that the language skills for serious diplomatic interpreting, certainly in this period, and actually very often right through into the 21st century, are very often the result of deep immersion in another culture. So both Li Zibiao and George Thomas Staunton had strong cross-cultural friendships as children and young adults. Li Zibiao's best friend in Naples, Li Zibiao was much younger than the other Chinese students in Naples, and his best friend, his closest relationship in Naples, was with someone called Giovanni Maria Borgia, who is a Neapolitan Naples aristocrat. And they're still writing to each other in the 1820s, 20 years after Li Zibiao returned to China. George Thomas Staunton had very good early friends who are some of the young compradors, the Mai Ban, which these are people who are employed in the British factory all day, working every day in the British factories in Guangzhou. And they obviously have very close relationships. They help him with his translation. They become personally very close. They advise him on how to behave. And they're the same kind of age as him. And he, as it happened, also had very bad relations with his English colleagues, because they all came from a certain small group of families who were associated with the East India Company. And he was actually from an Irish, completely outsider background. And when you have these kind of people with these close friendships and this deep immersion in another culture, it becomes really impossible for an outsider or the person using the interpreter to really be sure of the internal balance of loyalties of that interpreter. And that creates problems of trust. And then, of course, this is particularly problematic during the period of the consolidation of British rule in India, which I think is underestimated. I mean, obviously, all of you in Singapore, this is the process that produces Singapore, but it has been poorly integrated into Chinese history. I think we need to look at that as part of a transformation of an early modern world where there's really considerable admiration for other cultures, that Jesuit vision of China as a model for Enlightenment Europe, Ming and very early Qing interest in Western astronomy and other sciences, and then the transformation of that into the imperialism of the 19th century. And of course, a key part of that is the presence of British warships off the south coast of China as part of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And I would suggest that the Qing actually reinvigorates aspects of the classical tribute system. The Jiaqing Emperor is much more concerned about the kowtow and these tribute system formalities than Qianlong had been. But they also bring increased danger to the interpreters and mediators as a result. Two friends of George Thomas Staunton were arrested and exiled to Xinjiang to his extreme unhappiness in the 1810s. And actually, the Jiaqing Emperor issues edicts specifically against George Thomas Staunton. And Li Zibiao ends up in hiding in a very remote village in Shanxi. And all that wealth of knowledge and that competence which Li Zibiao had was clearly extremely useful, what could have been extremely useful for the Chinese state, is hiding away and basically lost to the Chinese state. And these people are examples of a wider process. So that those state actors against interpreters, those state actions are important. And I ended up having the feeling that these interpreters were kind of ground to pieces between the growing conflicts of these empires. So what I'm going to go on and just tell you for a few minutes about is I'm actually going on to an entire new project about the 20th century, but I'm also writing a couple of papers that lead out of this project. And if we go on to the next slide, the first of them is on pulse diagnosis, Chinese pulse diagnosis in 18th century Naples. So it follows one of the minor characters who turns up in this book, who's a man called Xu Shizhi, who went to Naples to study at the same time as Li Zibiao. He's one of Li Zibiao's classmates, but he was an adult when he went to Naples. And he'd been a leader of his Christian community, which also came from Gansu, and he'd studied law and medicine. And as soon as he arrived in Naples, he became enormously famous as a doctor. And the letter you see on the right here is a letter from an aristocrat in Naples asking to be visited by the famous young Chinese. He treated nobility and elites in Naples for about 6 years using Chinese methods of diagnosing through the pulse. And he came to know someone called Domenico Cirillo, who wrote the book that you see on the left, which is a textbook for how to diagnose the pulse, where he just incorporates Chinese methods of pulse diagnosis as just, that's what you should do. with this, I want to argue that actually, because he was there in person, he was able to convey those things through the body rather than just through words. And when you describe Chinese pulse diagnosis in words in Europe, there had been translated text, but it was basically impossible for European doctors to understand. But European doctors were really interested because they were working on the history of the nerve, working on understanding the nervous system at that point. And they felt that these very sophisticated modes of feeling in the pulse, which is what we now get through, you know, complicated machinery, could enable them to further understand the nervous system. So that's one of these projects. And then if we go on to the final slide, the other one that I'm looking at is the influence of George Leonard and George Thomas Staunton's Irish Catholic background on George Thomas Staunton's ability to become an interpreter to China. So the Macartney Embassy is usually seen as very clearly British. And we often assume that the Stauntons, that Macartney and Staunton were English, but they were not. They were Irish. Both of them were Irish. Macartney was Irish Protestant, but Staunton's family was actually Irish Catholic. George Leonard Staunton, the father, was educated at a Jesuit school in France. It's a classic Irish Catholic background, though he later married an English Protestant woman. So he clearly operated as if he were Protestant. It's very unclear what his actual beliefs were. He may in fact have been atheist because he was a huge supporter of the French Revolution. But what I want to look at here is how the fact that he had all these Catholic connections gave him access to that Jesuit knowledge, much more access than most English people would have, both in finding these interpreters for the embassy, but also in getting hold of books. The Vatican actually offered him a huge dictionary, these manuscript dictionaries. They hadn't published actual linguistic works. Obviously, the Jesuits published loads of stuff, but they don't publish their training materials in the language. Those are only available as manuscript. The Vatican actually lends the Stauntons a 5-volume manuscript dictionary compiled by a missionary in Beijing as a means of learning the Chinese language. And then George Thomas Staunton later uses a lot of these Catholic connections in Macau as part of his process of really seriously learning Chinese to the extent that he can translate the Qing legal code. And with that one, I'm looking at how Catholic identity could actually open up opportunities within the British Empire, which we normally see as something very strongly English and Protestant, and enable its expansion. Okay, thank you all very much. I hope that there are lots of thoughts that you might have and interesting things that you might be able to suggest.